The ticket was already written before he even woke up. 67 years old, sleeping across the front seat of his beat-up Chevy, and Officer Martinez was tapping on the window with his flashlight like the old man was some kind of common vagrant. "Can't sleep here, sir. This is a public parking lot." The voice was cold, bureaucratic, professional indifference wrapped in a uniform. The old man stirred slowly, his joints protesting after hours cramped in the cab, and when he finally rolled down the window, Martinez was already scribbling on his citation pad. No questions asked, no conversation attempted, just the mechanical process of enforcement. "I'm sorry, officer," the old man said, his voice gravelly from sleep and decades of cigarettes he'd quit 20 years too late. "I didn't know there was an ordinance. I was just—" But Martinez cut him off with a raised hand. "Sir, I need to see your license and registration." The old man fumbled through a worn leather wallet, the kind that holds a lifetime of receipts, and faded photographs, and handed over documents that Martinez barely glanced at. The name on the license read, Thomas Eugene Hartwell, address listed as a VA facility 2 towns over, but Martinez didn't notice or didn't care, or maybe both. The citation was for $150, illegal overnight parking in a commercial district. Thomas stared at the yellow slip of paper like it was written in a foreign language. $150 might as well have been $1,500 to a man living on a disability pension that barely covered his medications. "Officer, I just lost my apartment. I've been staying at the shelter, but they're full tonight, and I thought—" Martinez was already walking back to his patrol car. "Case closed. Problem solved. Move along." Thomas sat there in the growing dawn light, holding that citation, and something inside him that had been strong for 7 decades finally cracked. Not broke. Men like Thomas don't break, but cracked just enough to let some of the pain leak out. He'd served his country for 26 years, survived 3 tours in Vietnam when survival was more luck than skill. Came home to a nation that pretended the war never happened, and soldiers were something to be quietly ashamed of. Worked construction until his back gave out, raised 2 kids who barely called anymore, and now he was being fined for the crime of having nowhere to sleep. But that wasn't just any old man sleeping in a truck. And that citation Officer Martinez handed out so casually was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career. If you believe that those who served deserve better than bureaucratic indifference, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Because what happened next proves that some bonds between soldiers never break, even when the world tries to pretend they don't exist. Thomas folded the citation carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, right next to his heart. He'd been carrying worse burdens in that same spot for 50 years. The weight of friends who didn't come home, the guilt of survival when better men died, the quiet ache of a country that welcomed him back with parades and then forgot about him before the confetti was swept from the streets. But this morning, something was different. This morning, the weight felt unbearable. He started the truck. It took 3 tries like it always did, and pulled out of the parking lot that had cost him $150 he didn't have. The gas gauge was showing empty, which meant he had maybe 20 miles before he'd be walking. 20 miles to figure out where a 67-year-old veteran goes when the world runs out of places for him. The shelter would have beds available tomorrow night, maybe. The VA facility where he officially lived was a 6-hour bus ride away, and the next bus wouldn't leave until Thursday. It was Monday morning. He drove aimlessly through streets that looked the same in every small American town. Gas stations and fast food restaurants and strip malls that sold everything nobody really needed. Normal people going to normal jobs, living normal lives, completely unaware that one of the men who'd helped preserve their right to normalcy was counting quarters to see if he could afford a cup of coffee. Thomas didn't blame them. He'd fought so they wouldn't have to think about fighting. He'd sacrificed so they wouldn't have to sacrifice. The invisibility was part of the deal, even if nobody had explained that part when he signed up. What they also hadn't explained was how the proudest moment of his life would become the most irrelevant. 26 years of service, 3 bronze stars, a Purple Heart, and a chest full of ribbons that meant everything to him and nothing to Officer Martinez. When had "thank you for your service" become just words people said to make themselves feel better? When had honoring veterans become something you did one day a year and then forgot about? Thomas pulled into another parking lot, this one behind a 24-hour diner that probably wouldn't call the police if he sat in his truck for a few hours. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 3 tours making sure Americans could sleep safely in their beds, and now he couldn't find a legal place to sleep in his truck. But something was happening that Thomas didn't know about yet. Something that would change everything. Because 60 hours earlier and 800 miles away, Master Sergeant Patricia Chen had received a phone call that would set extraordinary events in motion. Patricia ran the unofficial network that connected retired military personnel across the Southwest, the kind of network that exists in the spaces between official channels. Coffee shop conversations and VFW meetings and late-night phone calls between people who understood that some obligations never expire, and someone had called Patricia about an old soldier who needed help. The call had come from Maria Santos, who worked the night shift at the VA Medical Center in Riverside. Maria had been processing Thomas Hartwell's paperwork when she noticed something that made her pause: his service record, his decorations, his age, and most importantly, the address change form that showed he'd been forced to leave his apartment. Maria had seen too many veterans slip through the cracks, and something about Thomas's file made her pick up the phone. "Patricia? It's Maria from Riverside VA. I've got a situation here that I think you need to know about." And Patricia, who had 22 years of Air Force experience and a personal mission to make sure no veteran faced their battles alone, had listened to every word. By the time Maria finished explaining, Patricia was already making a list of people to call. The network activated the way it always did. Quietly, efficiently, with the kind of precision that comes from decades of military training applied to civilian problems. Within 6 hours, Patricia had Thomas's complete service record, his current location, his financial situation, and a plan that would have made his old commanding officers proud. She'd also made one very special phone call to a friend who owed her a favor, a big favor. The kind of favor that could move mountains, or in this case, move aircraft. But Thomas didn't know any of this as he sat in that diner parking lot, staring at a citation that represented so much more than a parking fine. He didn't know that his name was being passed through communication channels that spanned 3 time zones. He didn't know that people he'd never met were working to solve problems he hadn't even asked them to solve. He didn't know that military precision was being applied to a mission of mercy that would restore his faith in the bonds that connect those who serve. All Thomas knew was that he was tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of being forgotten. Tired of watching his country treat its veterans like inconvenient reminders of wars they'd rather forget. He'd given the best years of his life to something bigger than himself, and now he was being fined for existing in a world that had no place for him. He pulled out his phone, an ancient flip phone that made calls and nothing else, and stared at the contact list. 3 names. His daughter in Oregon, who had her own problems. His son in Florida, who'd made it clear that Dad's war stories weren't welcome anymore. And the VA crisis hotline that he'd never called because asking for help felt like admitting defeat. Thomas put the phone away and closed his eyes. Tomorrow he'd figure out how to pay the fine. Tomorrow he'd find somewhere legal to sleep. Tomorrow he'd continue the quiet battle of surviving in a world that had moved on without him. But tonight, he was just going to sit in his truck and remember when his service meant something, when being a soldier was a source of pride instead of an invisible burden. He had no idea that tomorrow would be different. That tomorrow, the sky would remind him exactly what his service had meant. That tomorrow, the bonds he thought had been forgotten would prove stronger than time, stronger than distance, and certainly stronger than one small-town police officer's casual indifference. The radio in Thomas's truck was older than most of the cars in the parking lot, but it still worked well enough to pick up the local news station. He wasn't really listening, just letting the familiar rhythm of commercial radio fill the silence, when something caught his attention. A story about the city council's new initiative to clean up downtown by enforcing overnight parking restrictions more aggressively. The reporter interviewed Officer Martinez, who spoke with the confident tone of a man who believed he was making his community safer by targeting vagrants and transients. "We're not trying to be heartless," Martinez said through the tinny speakers, But we have businesses to protect and a community standard to maintain. People can't just decide that public parking lots are their personal camping grounds. The reporter asked about accommodations for homeless individuals, and Martinez's response made Thomas's hands tighten on the steering wheel. There are proper channels for that. Shelters, social services, family members. Most of these people have options they're choosing not to use. Thomas turned off the radio with more force than necessary. Options they're choosing not to use. As if sleeping in your truck was a lifestyle choice instead of a last resort. As if every person forced to spend the night in their vehicle hadn't already exhausted every other possibility. As if dignity was something you automatically forfeited the moment your circumstances became visible to people who'd never missed a meal or wondered where they'd sleep. He thought about his options. The daughter in Oregon who loved him but lived in a studio apartment with 2 roommates and worked 3 jobs to pay rent in a city where teachers couldn't afford to live. The son in Florida who'd inherited his mother's gift for holding grudges and had never forgiven Thomas for the years when military deployment meant missing Christmas mornings and birthday parties. The VA facility that was technically his address, but practically a warehouse for broken soldiers who'd become too expensive to fix and too inconvenient to remember. Those were his options. That was the safety net Officer Martinez believed he was choosing to ignore. But Thomas wasn't angry anymore. Anger required energy he didn't have, hope he couldn't afford. Instead, he felt something worse than anger: resignation. The quiet acceptance. That comes when you realize the world has categorized you as a problem instead of a person. He'd seen it happen to other veterans. Good men who'd served with honor and returned to a country that appreciated their service in theory, but found their presence inconvenient in practice. The sun was setting behind the diner, painting the parking lot in shades of orange and red that reminded him of a sunset in Da Nang 47 years ago. He'd been 20 then, scared and brave and absolutely certain that what he was doing mattered, that his service was part of something larger than himself, something permanent, something that would outlast political changes and cultural shifts, and the natural human tendency to forget uncomfortable truths. Thomas pulled out the citation again and read it more carefully this time. The fine print mentioned a court date, an appeals process, community service options for those who couldn't pay. Bureaucratic mercy dispensed through official channels by people who would never understand that for some veterans, asking for help felt like surrender. That admitting you couldn't handle civilian life was like admitting that everything you'd learned in the military, self-reliance, discipline, taking care of your own problems, had been a lie. He'd pay the fine. Somehow. Maybe sell something. Maybe skip meals for a month. Maybe call one of those veteran assistance numbers that promised help, but delivered forms and waiting lists and the polite indifference of overwhelmed social workers. He'd pay it because the alternative was having his license suspended, and without the ability to drive, he'd lose what little independence he had left. But as Thomas sat there planning his financial surrender, something extraordinary was happening, 200 miles away. Patricia Chen was making her final preparations for an operation that would have impressed Thomas's old commanding officers with its complexity and precision. She'd coordinated with air traffic control, cleared flight paths, obtained special permissions, and activated a network of military personnel that stretched from active duty to long-retired veterans who still understood that some missions were too important to abandon. The plan was ambitious, maybe impossible, but Patricia had learned in 22 years of Air Force service that impossible just meant you hadn't found the right combination of people and resources yet. She'd found both. The people who remembered what service meant, the resources to honor that service, and the will to prove that some bonds don't break just because the uniforms come off. Thomas's phone rang. The ancient flip phone that barely held a charge and only made calls. He almost didn't answer. Unknown number. Probably a scammer trying to sell him something he couldn't afford. But something made him flip it open. "Is this Thomas Hartwell?" The voice was female, professional, with the crisp precision that comes from military training. "Yes, ma'am." "Mr. Hartwell, this is Master Sergeant Patricia Chen, retired Air Force. I understand you've been having some difficulties, and I wanted you to know that you're not alone." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. The formal introduction, the respectful tone, the acknowledgement of his situation without judgment or pity. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think you might have the wrong person. Vietnam veteran, 3 tours, 26 years of service, currently facing some challenges with housing and local authorities. How do you... Mr. Hartwell, I'm going to ask you to do something that might seem strange. Tomorrow evening, I need you to be in the parking lot where you received that citation, at exactly 1900 hours. Can you do that for me? Thomas stared at the phone. This was either the most elaborate scam he'd ever encountered, or something else entirely. Something that made his pulse quicken with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, someone still remembered what his service had meant. Ma'am, I don't understand what this is about. You will tomorrow. 1900 hours, Mr. Hartwell. And Thomas? Patricia's voice softened just slightly. Thank you for your service. The real thanks, not the empty words. What you did mattered then, and it matters now. The line went dead, leaving Thomas staring at his phone like it had just delivered a message from another world, which, in a way, it had. The rest of that day passed in a strange haze of anticipation and disbelief. Thomas found himself thinking about Patricia Chen's voice, trying to decode the meaning behind her words. Military personnel developed a particular way of speaking when they were planning operations. Calm, confident, with the kind of certainty that comes from having backup plans for backup plans. Patricia had sounded like she was briefing him for a mission. He spent the night in a different parking lot, one behind a church, where the pastor had quietly spread the word that veterans were welcome to park overnight as long as they were gone by morning services. Thomas wasn't religious, but he respected the gesture. Someone who understood that sometimes help had to be offered quietly, without forms or requirements or the bureaucratic machinery that turned mercy into a process. The next day dragged like a combat patrol through hostile territory. Every hour felt like a day, every minute examined and re-examined for clues about what Patricia Chen had planned. Thomas found himself cleaning his truck, shaving more carefully than he had in months, pressing his only decent shirt with the iron in the church basement that the pastor had told him he could use. By 1800 hours, he was parked at the edge of the lot where Officer Martinez had written the citation that started everything. The same spot where he'd been sleeping 24 hours earlier, when his biggest worry was finding legal places to spend the night. Now he was waiting for something he couldn't identify, arranged by someone who somehow knew his entire military history. The parking lot was busier than it had been the previous morning. People finishing their workdays, stopping for groceries, living their normal lives in the normal rhythm of a small American town. Thomas wondered if any of them would understand what was about to happen. If any of them would recognize the significance of what Patricia Chen had set in motion. At exactly 1900 hours, Thomas heard it. A sound that made his spine straighten and his hands move automatically to attention position. The deep, unmistakable roar of military aircraft approaching at low altitude. Not the commercial jets that passed over the town on their way to larger airports, but the specific pitch and power that could only come from Air Force equipment. Other people in the parking lot heard it too. Heads turned upward, conversations stopped, and everyone began scanning the sky for the source of the sound that seemed to be growing louder and closer with each passing second. Thomas stepped out of his truck, his heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and recognition. Then he saw it. A C-130 Hercules, flying lower than any aircraft had any business flying over a civilian area, its massive frame blocking out the evening sun as it passed directly overhead. But this wasn't just any C-130. This was a demonstration of precision, flying that took Thomas's breath away. The aircraft maintained perfect formation, perfect altitude, perfect speed as it executed a flyover that was clearly designed for an audience of one. As the Hercules passed overhead, Thomas could see people inside the aircraft, figures in military uniforms standing at the open cargo door, and as the plane directly passed over his position, something fell from the cargo bay. Not dropped carelessly, but deployed with the precision that comes from hours of planning and practice. A parachute opened, slowing the descent of what Thomas now realized was a care package. But not just any care package. This one was clearly marked with his name, his service number, and the emblem of his old unit. As it drifted down, toward the parking lot, Thomas felt 47 years of civilian life fall away. Suddenly he was 20 again, watching supply drops in the jungle, believing absolutely in the bonds that connected soldiers across time and distance. The package landed 50 feet away from his truck, and Thomas walked toward it with the measured pace of a man who was afraid that moving too quickly might break the spell. Around him, other people in the parking lot had stopped what they were doing to watch this impossible scene unfold. A few had their phones out, recording what they probably thought was some kind of publicity stunt or marketing campaign. But Thomas knew better. This was something else entirely. This was the military precision he remembered, applied to a mission of honor that proved some things were more important than regulations or convenience, or the casual indifference of people who'd never worn them. Uniform. Inside the package, Thomas found items that made his eyes water with recognition and gratitude. A handwritten letter from Patricia Chen explaining how the network of veterans had learned about his situation and decided to respond. A check for $5,000 from a fund maintained by retired military personnel for exactly these kinds of emergencies. A new VA identification card that would help him access services he'd been too proud to request. And most importantly, a leather folder containing letters from dozens of veterans who wanted him to know that his service was remembered, respected, and honored by people who understood its true cost. But the flyover wasn't finished. As Thomas knelt in the parking lot reading Patricia's letter, he heard the sound of the C-130 returning. This time it was accompanied by two F-16 Fighting Falcons, flying in perfect formation as they executed a second pass over the parking lot. This wasn't just a supply drop anymore. This was a full military tribute, performed with the kind of precision that demonstrated how seriously these people took their mission. The F-16s broke formation directly over Thomas's position, executing a missing man formation that brought him to his feet and to attention without conscious thought. 47 years of civilian life couldn't override the automatic response to military protocol. Around him, other people in the parking lot began to understand that they were witnessing something significant, something that transformed an ordinary evening in an ordinary town into a moment of extraordinary honor. As the aircraft disappeared into the distance, Thomas looked around at the faces surrounding him. People who had been going about their normal business moments earlier were now staring at him with expressions of curiosity, respect, and dawning understanding. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to honor this old man in the parking lot. Someone had moved heaven and earth, or at least aircraft and military personnel, to prove that his service mattered. A woman approached him cautiously, her phone still recording. "Sir, what just happened here? Who are you?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then at the package in his hands, then at the sky where the sound of the aircraft was fading into memory. "Ma'am, I'm just an old soldier who forgot that some people still remember what service means." But he was wrong about that. He wasn't just an old soldier anymore. He was the center of a story that would spread far beyond this parking lot, far beyond this small town, far beyond the ordinary boundaries of one man's life. Because Patricia Chen had done more than arrange a tribute. She'd created a moment that would remind everyone who witnessed it that some bonds don't break, some debts don't expire, and some people are worth moving mountains, or aircraft, to. The local news crew arrived within an hour, having been tipped off by someone who understood that this story needed to be told. But they were too late to film the flyover. All they found was Thomas Hartwell, sitting in his truck, holding a package that had literally fallen from the sky, surrounded by people who wanted to understand what they'd just witnessed. The reporter, a young woman who'd probably never met a Vietnam veteran, approached Thomas with the kind of nervous respect that comes from knowing you're in the presence of something larger than your usual assignment. "Mr. Hartwell, can you tell us what happened here tonight?" Thomas looked at her, then at the growing crowd of people who'd heard about the incident and come to see for themselves. He thought about Patricia Chen's letter, about the check that would solve his immediate problems, about the letters from veterans who'd taken the time to write to a stranger because they understood the obligation that connects people who've served. "Young lady, what happened here tonight is that I learned something I'd forgotten. I learned that when you serve your country, you become part of something that doesn't end when you take off the uniform. You become part of a family that looks out for each other, even when you think you've been forgotten. The reporter asked more questions, but Thomas wasn't really paying attention anymore. He was thinking about Officer Martinez, who'd written that citation with such casual indifference. He was thinking about the bureaucratic machinery that processed veterans like problems instead of treating them like people. He was thinking about all the Thomas Hartwells across the country who were sleeping in their trucks tonight, believing they'd been forgotten by the nation they'd served. But mostly, he was thinking about Patricia Chen and the network of veterans, who'd proven that some things were more important than convenience, more lasting than gratitude, and more powerful than the forces that tried to make old soldiers invisible. The story spread the way stories do in the age of social media. Within hours, the video of Thomas kneeling in the parking lot was being shared across platforms by people who understood instinctively that they were witnessing something important. The missing man formation, the precision of the flyover, the obvious planning that had gone into honoring one forgotten veteran, it all combined to create a narrative that reminded viewers what real honor looked like. By morning, Thomas had received dozens of phone calls from people wanting to help, to contribute, to be part of something that proved America still remembered how to honor its veterans. The VA facility where he was officially housed called to inform him that a private room had become available, permanently. Local businesses reached out to offer employment, services, and support. The mayor of the town where he'd been cited called to personally apologize and to invite him to be the Grand Marshal of the upcoming Veterans Day parade. But the most important call came from Patricia Chen herself, who wanted to make sure Thomas understood that the previous night's events were just the beginning, not the end. Mr. Hartwell, what happened yesterday was about honoring your service. But what happens next is about making sure it doesn't happen to other veterans. We've got work to do. And they did have work to do, because Thomas's story had illuminated a problem that extended far beyond one man's struggle with housing and bureaucracy. It had revealed the gap between American rhetoric about supporting veterans and the reality of how many veterans actually lived. It had demonstrated the difference between saying thank you for your service and actually serving those who'd served. Within a month, Patricia's network had expanded into a formal organization dedicated to identifying and assisting veterans who'd fallen through the cracks of official support systems. They called it the Silent Valor Project, and their first mission was to make sure that no veteran would ever again be fined for sleeping in their truck, while the community around them remained indifferent to their service and sacrifice. Thomas became the organization's first official success story and its most effective advocate. He spoke at VFW meetings, church gatherings, and civic organizations about the reality of veteran homelessness and the power of community action. But more importantly, he worked directly with other veterans who found themselves in situations similar to his own. The police department in the town where he'd been cited implemented new protocols for dealing with homeless individuals, especially veterans. Officer Martinez, who'd become an unwitting catalyst for change, volunteered for additional training on veteran affairs and became one of the department's most effective advocates for treating all citizens, housed or unhoused, with dignity and respect. The parking lot where Thomas had slept that night, where he'd received the citation that started everything, where he'd watched aircraft honor his service in ways he'd never imagined possible, became the site of an annual memorial service for veterans who'd died homeless and forgotten. Each year, the ceremony ended with a flyover, smaller than Thomas's tribute, but meaningful in its consistency and its reminder that some obligations never expire. But perhaps the most significant change was in Thomas himself. The resignation and invisibility that had characterized his civilian life after retirement gave way to a sense of purpose that reminded him why he'd served in the first place, not for parades or recognition or even gratitude, but for the belief that some things were worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth the sacrifice of individual comfort for collective good. He never did pay that $150 citation. The mayor had it dismissed as part of the city's formal apology, and the money Thomas had been prepared to sacrifice for a bureaucratic mistake went instead to the Silent Valor Project's Emergency Assistance Fund. But he kept the citation, framed on the wall of his new apartment, as a reminder of how quickly circumstances can change when people decide that honor is more important than convenience. The story of Thomas Hartwell and the night aircraft honored. His service became part of the mythology that connects American veterans across generations and conflicts. It was shared in VFW halls and American Legion posts, told and retold with the kind of embellishment that comes when a story means more than its literal facts. But the core truth remained constant. Sometimes when the world seems to have forgotten your service, someone remembers. Someone cares. Someone is willing to move heaven and earth, or at least aircraft, to prove that your sacrifice mattered. Years later, when reporters asked Thomas about that night, about what it meant to watch military aircraft honor him in a parking lot where he'd been treated like a vagrant, his answer was always the same. It wasn't about me. It was about every veteran who's ever wondered if their service meant anything after they hung up the uniform. It was proof that we're still part of something larger than ourselves, even when we feel most alone. And in the end, that was exactly what Patricia Chen had intended. Not just to solve one veteran's immediate problems, but to demonstrate the power of the bonds that connect those who've served. To prove that military precision could be applied to missions of mercy. To show that honor wasn't just a word people used in speeches, but a principle that could move aircraft and change lives and transform a moment of bureaucratic indifference into a story of lasting significance. The network Patricia had activated to help Thomas continued to grow and operate long after his immediate crisis had passed. They helped thousands of veterans navigate the complex system of benefits and services. They provided emergency assistance to families facing eviction or utility shutoffs. They connected isolated veterans with communities that understood their experience. And most importantly, they proved that the obligation to serve doesn't end when the uniform comes off. It just changes form. Thomas lived long enough to see the Silent Valor Project become a model for veteran assistance programs across the country. He lived long enough to watch Officer Martinez become one of the most effective advocates for homeless veterans in the region. He lived long enough to see the attitudes in his small town and in communities across America shift from casual indifference to active support for those who'd served. But most importantly, he lived long enough to understand that the night aircraft honored him in a parking lot wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of a conversation about how America treats its veterans. The beginning of a movement to bridge the gap between rhetoric and reality when it comes to supporting those who've served. The beginning of the recognition that thank you for your service means nothing unless it's followed by action that demonstrates genuine gratitude. The last time anyone saw Thomas, he was in that same parking lot, not sleeping in his truck, but helping another veteran who'd found himself with nowhere else to go. The cycle continuing, the obligation passed forward, the bonds between those who've served proving stronger than time, stronger than bureaucracy, and certainly stronger than the forces that try to make old soldiers invisible. If you believe that those who served our country deserve more than empty words of gratitude, if you think that honor should be more than a concept we celebrate one day a year, then share this story. Because somewhere tonight, there's another Thomas Hartwell sleeping in his truck, wondering if anyone remembers what his service meant. And maybe, if enough people remember this story, someone will make a phone call that changes everything.